tune I thought I was going to sing. What I had queued up was Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Old time Kalakawa Avenue tune.
Yay.
But that's not what happened. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 So today we'll discuss Srimad Bhagawatam, Canto 3, Chapter 6, Text 3. Is this okay? It's not killing my ears, so I wonder if it's actually working. Okay. So, I'm sorry. Do I need to do that again? Canto 3, Chapter 6, Text 3. So Anupravishta Bhagavans Sanupravishto Bhagavans. That's not what I was expecting either. Cheshtarupena Tam Ganam Cheshtarupena Tam Ganam Bhinnam Samyojayam Asa Bhinnam Samyojayam Asa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan Suktam Karma Prabodhayan Somnu Pravishto Bhagavan Cheshtarupena Tanganam Bhinnam Samyojayamasa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan Sonu Pravishto Bhagavan Cheshtarupena Tanganam Bhinnam Samyojayamasa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan. Others, please.
So you pravisto Bhagavan Cheshtarupena Tam Ganam Vinam Samyojayam Asa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan
Sonu Pravishto Bhagavan Cheshtarupena Tanganam Vinam Samyojayamasa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan
Sonu Pravishto Bhagavan Cheshtarupena Tanganam Vinam Samyojayamasa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan
Sonu Pravishto Bhagavan
Cheshtarupena Tanganam Vinam Samyojayamasa Suktam Karma Prabodhayan
Synonyms.
Sono pravishta bhagavan.
Sono pravishta bhagavan.
Chaitarupena tanganam.
Chaitarupena tanganam.
Vinam samojayam nasa.
Vinam samyojayam nasa.
Sukam karma prabodhayam.
Sukam karma prabodhayam.
Anyone else? Synonyms. Saha,
Saha.
that.
That.
Anupravishta,
Anupravishta.
thus entering later on.
Thus entering later on.
Bhagavan,
Bhagavan.
personality of Godhead.
Personality of Godhead.
Cheshtarupena,
Chestarupena.
by his representation of attempt.
By his representation of attempt.
Kali.
Kali.
Oh, that's the external energy. Tam,
Tam.
them.
Them.
Ganam,
Ganam.
all the living entities,
All the living entities,
including the demigods.
including the demigods.
Not going to leave them out. Bhinnam,
Vinam.
separately.
Separately.
Samyojayamasa,
Samyojayamasa.
engaged to work.
Engaged to work.
Suktam,
Sukam.
sleeping.
Sleeping.
Karma,
Karma.
work.
Work.
Prabodhayam,
Prabodhayam.
enlightening.
Enlightening.
Interesting word there. Last word, prabodhayam. And the next verse starts with the word prabuddha. So buddha means awake. Prabuddha means really awake. Like prabhuchita, right? Completely reject, at the very beginning of the Bhagavatam, second verse, dharma prochita, prabhuchita, completely rejecting. Just like sarvadharma parityaja, same thing, right? Really strong, underlying, bold-faced, italics, blinking neon lights. So, prabuddha. And here, it's a different form, enlightening, really enlightening. So tomorrow we'll get prabuddha. Oh, and by the way, one of the Navyogendras in the 11th canto, second, third, fourth, fifth chapters of the 11th canto is prabuddha. And his father is, pop quiz,
Rishabdev.
yes, Rishabdev. Trying to give somebody else a chance. Yeah, okay. Translation. Thus, when the personality of Godhead entered into the elements by his energy, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. Responsibly, please. Thus, when the personality of Godhead
Thus the personality of Godhead
entered into the elements by his energy,
entered into the elements by his energy,
all the living entities
all the living entities
were enlivened into different activities,
were enlivened into different activities,
just as one is engaged in his work
just as one is engaged in his work
after awakening from sleep.
after awakening from sleep.
Srila Prabhupada's purport. Every individual soul remains unconscious after the dissolution of the creation and thus enters into the Lord with his material energy. These individual living entities are conditioned souls everlastingly, but in each and every material creation they are given a chance to liberate themselves and become free souls. Stick a pin in that one. Right, Lily?
Yeah.
Gotcha. They're all given a chance to take advantage of the Vedic wisdom and find out what is their relationship with the Supreme Lord, how they can be liberated, and what the ultimate profit is in such liberation. So 3 stages of knowledge, 3 kinds of knowledge. What is their relationship with the Lord? What do we call that in Sanskrita, Sambandha, Bhakti means back. How they can be liberated, what do we call that? Jumping the gun. Abhideya. How we get liberated, and what the ultimate profit is in such liberation. Kusha.
What I just said.
Exactly. Prayojan. By properly studying the Vedas, one becomes conscious of his position and thus takes to the transcendental devotional service of the Lord and is gradually promoted to the spiritual sky. The individual souls in the material world engage in different activities according to their past unfinished desires. After the dissolution of a particular body, you have another pin, Lily? Gotcha. Thank you. After the dissolution of a particular body, the individual soul forgets everything. But the all-merciful Lord, who is situated in everyone's heart as the witness, the supersoul, awakens him and reminds him of his past desires, and thus he begins to act accordingly in his next life. This unseen guidance is described as fate, and a sensible man can understand that this continues his material bondage in the three modes of material nature. The unconscious sleeping stage of the living entity, just after the partial or total dissolution of creation, is wrongly accepted as the final stage of life by some less intelligent philosophers. After the dissolution of the partial material body, the living entity remains unconscious for only a few months, and after the total dissolution of the material creation, he remains unconscious for many millions of years. It's kind of a figure of speech, right? Many millions of years. How are there years if there aren't measuring instruments? They're dissolved and merged into the body of Mahavishnu. So it's kind of, it means a really long time. But when the creation is again revived, he's awakened to his work by the Lord. The living entity is eternal, and the wakeful state of his consciousness manifested by activities is his natural condition of life. He cannot stop acting while awake, and thus he acts according to his diverse desires. When his desires are trained in the transcendental service of the Lord, his life becomes perfect, and he is promoted to the spiritual sky to enjoy eternal awakened life. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Lankayate Girim Yakrapatamam Bande Shri Gurun Dinakaranam Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupakadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Anchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripasindhobhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo. Sonu Pravishto Bhagavans Cheshtarupen Tanganam Minnam Samyojayama Sasuktam Karma Prabodhanam. Thus, when the personality of Godhead entered into the elements by his energy, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. So, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains in his commentary on this verse, and that's almost all he says, that Cheshtarupena means by his energy of action, his Kriya Shakti. In other words, his energy of getting it done. just kind of seemed appropriate when I read that. Cheshta Rupena means by the Kriya Shakti, his energy of action, his energy of getting it done. When Kriya Shakti comes, stuff gets done, right? So that Kriya Shakti here, Cheshta Rupena, his representation of attempt, Kali. In other words, this is how his will becomes manifested externally. One of Krishna's qualities described in the Tattva Sandarbha, Jiva Goswami's Tattva Sandarbha. This is one of the Sandarbhas that describes, we talked about the 3 stages of spiritual knowledge a few minutes ago. So we've got, out of the 6 Sandarbhas, 4 of them discuss this Sambandha, this understanding, some understanding to one extent or another, and in one way or another in the different Sandarbhas of our relationship with Krishna. So the Tattva Sandarbha, I'm thinking of the Paramatma Sandarbha. The Paramatma Sandarbha describes the Super Soul, describes the Jiva, describes the Maya Shakti, and the relationships among those 3. The Paramatma is a manifestation of the Supreme Lord for interacting with the material world. So one of the qualities of the Lord is Satya Sankalpatva. In other words, whatever he conceives of, whatever he wills, whatever he determines, whatever his sankalpa, that actually happens, it comes true. So Krishna wants to enjoy, he creates other souls, because what do you do by yourself? There's not much to do by yourself. It's not particularly exciting. But if you have friends and family and folks to argue with, folks to go swimming with, all that, all the things that we do together, that makes things more interesting, more exciting. So he wills, and so he glances over the material energy. He wills the material energy to manifest bodies for the living entities that somehow or other have taken a wrong turn in one sense or another. So that's the Cheshta Rupa. There's another use of Cheshta Rupa we see in the Bhakti Rasamrita Siddhu. There are kind of 2 ways of serving the Lord, Cheshta Rupa Bhakti and Bhava Rupa Bhakti. Cheshta Rupa Bhakti is particularly applicable to those of us in sadhana bhakti. Use your senses to try to give some pleasure to the Lord. And then eventually when, as our bhakti begins to mature, we get to a certain stage and there's actually real internal feeling, real heart behind that, those activities. And that's Bhava Rupa. That's something that begins to manifest at higher stages, to some degree, at higher stages of sadhana bhakti, becomes fully in play in the stage of Bhava Bhakti, and is pretty much what there is in the stage of Prema Bhakti. So Srila Prabhupada says here at the beginning of the purport, it says, every individual soul remains unconscious after the dissolution of the creation and enters into the Lord with this material energy. So the material energy and the living entities, these 2 energies are wound up in the body of Mahavishnu as he inhales, transcendentally inhales. And then Srila Prabhupada says, these individual living entities are conditioned souls everlastingly, but in each and every material creation, they're given a chance to liberate themselves and become free souls. So I found this sentence particularly interesting because one of my engagements this month is a 4-part seminar on the 4 Vaishnava Sampradayas. And so I did the 3rd one yesterday morning. And that was on the Sri Sampradaya. And one thing that was pointed out, Ramanujacharya, when he was younger, what was the name of the person? He was studying under someone named Yadava Prakash. Yadava Prakash was teaching Advaita Vedanta, Kevala Advaita Vedanta. In other words, pure monism, the teachings of Shankaracharya. And Ramanuja just couldn't accommodate that. The idea that there's no distinction between the jiva as Brahman and the Supreme Brahman. And that you actually, on perfection, you become the whole thing or something. It just didn't work for him. So he kept challenging his guru on that. And at one point, Yadava Prakash actually put together a plot to kill Ramanuja because people were starting to pay attention to Ramanuja's arguments, and they were finding them and him quite attractive. So a little competitive. I mean, if you're all one, how does some competitive spirit arise, right? But somehow or other, we see this in Yadava Prakash. So he put together a conspiracy, a plot to kill Ramanuja. One of the other followers overheard this and tipped Ramanuja off. There was another attempt later, and I don't remember quite what that was about. But one of Ramanuja's contributions is the idea that the Supreme Person, that the absolute truth is ultimately a person. And that the living entities, the conditioned souls, living entities in the material world, are capable of becoming liberated. They're capable for aspiring to become liberated and actually practicing in a way that they attain moksha. Now, for Ramanujacharya, moksha means attaining Vaikuntha Loka, association with Lakshmi Narayana in Vaikuntha Loka. They refer to that as liberation. That's a different idea, interestingly, from Madhvacharya's idea, which is that there are liberated souls, Nitya Mukta, and there are conditioned souls, Nitya Baddha. And never the twain shall meet. The Nitya Baddha, so there's two kinds of souls. Just like I remember hearing from one of my friends. I have a couple of very philosophical friends with Jewish backgrounds. One of them is my friend Madan Mohan. Somebody you want to avoid if you can't be flexible about your time, because he'll ask you a question and will chase it down.
Jai Shri Panchatattva
Jai
Jai.
Panchatattva.
Madan always has something on his mind. He never wears a shirt without a breast pocket because it's something he uses. He stores either a few sheets of folded paper and a pen, or one of those little bitty spiral notebooks and a pen, until you'll see him in the middle of a kirtan even. He'll stop and he'll write something down because he doesn't want to lose an idea, a thought. And then he'll run those, whatever is dominating his thoughts for that week. If he gets within a couple of feet of you, then he's going to engage you in discussion. And that could go on for some time, days. And that's not hyperbole. He and his wife Vrindavaneshwari usually go out in an RV in the summer because it's so hot in the summer in a lodge, hot, humid, wet. So they'll go out and drive around the country, visit temples, visit Rath Yatras. So when it was time, so it would be late July, early August, just before the LA Rath Yatra, they would come down to San Diego. And they would come over to our apartment, and you couldn't get Madame to leave. And my wife would get so peeved because I couldn't get anything done, sometimes for like 3 days. It's so wonderful. He would kind of buttonhole me and just engage me in Krishna Katha for days. His wife would come and rescue me. Even at a sadhu sangha, we would have breakfast together sometimes, and Vrindavan would come and say, Madan, he probably needs to chant or read, or he wants to go to give the guy a break, She would drag him away. It's so cool. So he shared with me once many years ago that there's this idea in some corners of Jewish thinking that there are Jewish souls and other souls. I guess maybe we're generic souls or something like that. So Madhvacharya had this idea that there are liberated souls and there are conditioned souls, and the conditioned souls don't have, they can't actually aspire realistically for liberation, and they certainly can't attain it. I haven't puzzled that out yet. That's this week, because next week is the last one, and it's the Madhva Sampradaya, which is interesting. And you see, after the prominent acharyas, you see the teachings take different turns. And sometimes there are what some scholars might call schisms, but they're really just kind of like different branches of thinking. For example, in the Sri Sampradaya and Ramanuja Sampradaya, just after Ramanuja, there developed a couple of ideas between the northern and southern branches, the Tenkalai and the Vadakalai branches of Sri Vaishnavism. The southern branch, the Vadakalai, had the idea that liberation, that moksha is attained by grace. They call this the cat theory of moksha. Describing how the mother cat carries a kitten. The kitten is completely dependent on the mother, and she carries the kitten in her mouth. And now there's another thing about cats carrying something in their mouth. The kitten's being carried in the mother cat's mouth is a very different thing from the mouses being carried in the mother cat's mouth. For the kitten, there's no danger. They're completely, you watch them, they're completely relaxed. They're really, beyond chill. They're just thinking like, this is the whole thing, right? And however, when the mouse gets in the cat's mouth, there's nothing but danger. It's like death. So, and the northern group, the Tenkalai, the southern group, and the Vadakalai, the northern group, their idea is called the monkey idea of liberation, which describes how the mother monkey carries the baby monkey, which means the baby monkey's holding on for dear life. It's all effort, it's all about the baby monkey's effort. Our idea is kind of a fusion of the two, effort and grace. And it's kind of typified by, I was thinking yesterday, by Mother Yashoda, who was trying to bind Krishna around his belly, Dhamma Udara, with a rope. And there shouldn't be any problem with that. It's a cowherd household, plenty of rope around, right? So she's bringing all the rope from the household and trying to tie it around Krishna so he can't run away. And every time it comes up 2 fingers too short. And eventually she's able to do that after her hair's come down and the flower garlands are in her hair all over the floor, and she's got beads of sweat on her forehead. And eventually Krishna allows her to bind him out of affection, because he knows that's why she's trying to bind him. It's out of affection. So he responds by allowing her to do that. So she makes the effort, but it's grace that actually completes the thing. So, our sense is a little different maybe from those 2 groups of Sri Vaishnavas. So anyway, So Ramanuja introduced the idea that not only are the individual souls separate from and subordinate to the complete whole, and I think when we talked, it was a week just before that, it was Nimbarka Sampradaya, Kumaras. Yeah, the Kumaras. And so, they also have this idea that even though the individual soul and the absolute truth are both Brahman, they're still separate, and that the Supreme Person is the complete whole, and the individual souls are like sparks from that complete whole. So the Sri Vaishnavas share that, and that's their big distinction between them and the monists. However, what we have in common with the monists, with the Kevala Dvaitavads, Shankara's idea, is that the individual soul can aspire for and attain liberation. So Srila Prabhupada makes that point here. And how do we do that? We do that by first beginning to understand the nature of our relationship. Srila Prabhupada points out in his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita as it is, that there are 5 subjects there. There's God, the jiva, time,
Material energy.
the material energy, and karma. And 4 of those are eternal. Karma is the only thing that's not eternal. So when we study Sambandha again, we want to understand the relationship, the relationship especially between the living entity, the jiva, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Although we see also, in order to really refine that, we see in the Paramatma Sandarbha that we also need to understand the Maya Shakti. So Srila Prabhupada, and this is one of the things that Srila Prabhupada really brings home in his introduction to Bhagavad Gita as it is. Really struck me when I started reading that introduction. Is that this is about relationships. And he talks about the 5 kinds of relationships that the jiva can have with Krishna. And I'd never heard anything like that. When I asked my minister, Reverend McGee, must have been back in 1954, 55, something like that, what God's like and what we're supposed to do while we're here, he didn't have an answer, and I didn't find anybody who really had an answer. I mean, I got some better answers from my Episcopal minister when I was a teenager, but a little more essential in some ways. But I never really had a real, as we mentioned the other day, a real sense of what we mean by the absolute truth. God is the absolute truth. Prabhupada points out at the beginning of his introduction to the Bhagavatam that the concept of the absolute truth and the concept of God, the all-powerful guy who runs the universe, they're 2 completely different things. The absolute truth not only interacts with the material energy, but he's got his whole, ultimately, he's got his own whole life. Even Narayana is not his real life. That's kind of like God at the office. Whereas Vrindavan, Braja, that's God at home with his shoes off. Literally, right? Krishna won't wear shoes in Vrindavan. Mother Yashoda tells, kiddo, you got to wear shoes. You're going out there, there's rocks and stickers and all kinds of stuff. He says, I'll wear shoes when the cows wear shoes. If barefoot is good enough for the cows, it's good enough for me. So that's God at home. So we need to understand what our relationship is with God. And then we need to understand how to activate that, how to bring that into play. And so Srila Prabhupada points out in the last paragraph that in our wakeful state, we can't help but be active. And the thing about being active is that it creates samskaras in our subtle body, impressions in our subtle body. And a friend of mine, one sannyasi friend of mine, joked recently, I think I've shared this the other day, maybe not. It creates some scars, right? These impressions in our subtle body. And that accounts for the future desires, which the Prabhupada describes here as, where did it go? Well, anyway, unfinished desires, unfulfilled desires. They're still there. We may not be aware of them, but they're there, and they're going to kick in, because that's how the Lord has it set up. However, if we create bhakti samskaras, if we create some bhakti scars in our heart, then that'll be a whole different thing, because they'll come they'll also come into action once we come in contact with that Swarupa Shakti of the Lord. And we all have some experience of that. Kush's and mine goes back to May of 1969. And each of us has our story that, when you hear the Maha Mantra, sometimes it just, bang, like, I remember I used to hear it on KPOI FM when they would play the soundtrack to Hair. And I liked all the other songs. I thought they were cute and a little naughty, and that's okay. But the one that stuck with me was the one that had the Hare Krishna mantra in it. And I thought that was pretty cool. I didn't know what the heck it was about, but I knew it was something about Krishna and Rama, and I was into that I had some connection with India that I wasn't really aware of, I guess. I was really into Gandhi before I became a devotee. Really into Gandhi. I probably read everything I could get my hands on by and about Mohandas Gandhi. But when I heard the devotees singing the Maha Mantra, it was like, oh, game over. Just Srila Prabhupada reaching out through his disciples. And that's how that Swarup Shakti enters our heart. She takes shelter. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains this in Madhurya Kadambini. She's completely independent. She's every bit as independent as Krishna is. She can go everywhere, anywhere she wants. But here's how she chooses to work. She takes shelter in the hearts of the devotees who've accepted her. And when those devotees, as Madhyama Bhaktas, share their kindness with others, she just follows their lead. And guess what? This is the most powerful force of all. As we see in the Vedas, Bhakti has the power to show us Krishna. Bhakti has the power to bring us near to Krishna. Bhakti has the power to conquer Krishna. And we had a cliffhanger yesterday in our Nectar of Devotion class, because we were talking about one of the 6 symptoms, one of the 6 characteristics of Shuddha Bhakti or Uttama Bhakti, and that is the power to attract and control even Krishna. And when we read Jiva Goswami's commentary on that section of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, we see, we're talking about Sadhya Bhakti. Although in his commentary on one of my favorite first canto, 5th chapter verses, got to narrow it down because I only have about 18,000 favorite Bhagavatam verses. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that this quality of rasagraha, being haunted by rasa, which Srila Prabhupada describes as the taste of having served the Lord's lotus feet, he says that begins from the very first day of worshiping the Lord. And and then I looked and I found that Jiva Goswami says in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, obviously we're talking about Sadhya Bhakti here. But then when I looked in the Bhakti Sandarbha to see what he might say in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he has an extended argument going over 7 verses, using 7 verses from the 14th chapter of the 11th canto. So this is from the Uddhava Gita. Krishna teaching his friend Uddhava about how bhakti works. And Jiva Goswami says that out of those 7.5 verses, that discuss bhakti's power to control Krishna, 6.5 of those verses all are talking about sadhana bhakti. So he says clearly, even sadhana bhakti has some power to control the Lord. Otherwise, how would he give a conditioned soul bhava bhakti? So that's Jiva Goswami's argument. And when I found that, I just thought, okay, here's an article. So I got to write that. So, so when that happens, it's pretty much game over. You may not be toast now, but you just wait a few minutes. And you're done. You can stick a fork in you and you'll be done. You know? When bhakti entered, and we're, 52 years later, more than 52 years later, we're still around for some reason. You know, and Narayani Nagapati, long time too, and they've got their stories, and Alex has got his story about, you know, how he came in contact with devotees, Irina, in Minnesota, for goodness sake. Who knew? Okay, so maybe Krishna consciousness might go to, you know, the Arabian Peninsula, and maybe to Africa, but Minnesota, for goodness sake? The end of the earth? So, you know, this is the most powerful force. So we're kind of done. So one activity or another is going to create these samskaras, and then in our next life, because we didn't see this coming. I mean, we might have, and as soon as it happened, we might look back and think, oh, well, that explains that, and that explains this. But, you know, we didn't see it come. We were going to a Jimi Hendrix concert, for goodness sake. You know, we were going to hear Jimmy ask us to stand next to his fire, you know, experience a little purple haze or something like that. And it didn't happen that particular night. So, so when that happens, Srila Prabhupada says, then eventually we become trained in the transcendental service of the Lord. Our lives become perfect and we become promoted to the spiritual sky to enjoy eternal awakened life. Real Prabhodaya, which is what, you know, so Prabhupada's playing off that last word of this verse, which also leads off the next verse, which gives me an opportunity to stop. Anybody have any quick questions or comments? I also didn't see that tangent coming. So I had a very unexpected morning, even though I thought I had it all figured out. Okay, thank you so much for your attention and your patience. Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Amrita Gold.